No problem, Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca. Are you able to hear me?
Yep, no problem. I'm just trying to open the presentation and then I'll share it just so we can check.
Great.
Would you want me to put up the slide deck on my end?
Oh, that would be great if you can.
Awesome. Okay, just 1 second. Let me do that. Okay, I think we can start off. So
Hold on.
any luck? Okay,
Hold on
what
one
I will
second.
do is I will start
got
off
it.
with the introduction. Then once we get to you, then we'll be able to upload it from my end. If you're still having technical difficulties, just in the interest of time, that'll be
Yeah,
okay.
perfect. Perfect.
Awesome, great. Thank you, and to all who have logged in today. My name is Rebecca. I am the Program and Strategy Manager at the KEMRI-Wellcome Trust Research Program and your facilitator for this session. Apologies for the delay in starting off. We know how gadgets operate, a bit of technical hiccup, but we are up and running right now. A warm welcome to this webinar that we'll be discussing the development studies for vaccines in emergencies or chronic conflict. And this webinar is the fourth in a series of planned webinars with the goal of providing information on available career options in the field of vaccinology. Before we start, a few housekeeping matters. Kindly, and is going to be done in English with French translations. For those who are not conversant with Teams, kindly take. If you're using a laptop, it's going to be at the top of your screen. If you're using your phone, it's at the bottom of the screen is in a word cloud. Kindly feel free to use this chat option to share your questions during the presentation, and then we're going to address them during a very interactive question and answer session. And we will have a few open slots for people to directly ask questions to the presenters if you find that chatting and typing is not your kind of thing. If your internet is stable, you can raise up your hand using the available icon, and I will be able to unmute you for you to be able to ask your question. As earlier mentioned, this is a series of planned webinars with the goal of providing information of available career options in the field of vaccinology. And this is being run under the KEMRI-Wellcome Trust Research Program, which is a world-renowned health research unit of excellence that is based in Kilifi, Kenya, and in Nairobi, as well as Mbale in Uganda. So over the years, we have excelled in the use of novel ideas and collaborations to achieve better health for Africa, while also developing African research leaders and scientific leaders. Our main vision of the program is to undertake cutting-edge and novel research that is relevant to national, regional, and global needs. So it is under this program that we have the Vaccinology Workforce Development Program that aims to expand the technical know-how and capability of sustainable end-to-end vaccine research and development in Africa. And we're doing this through training and knowledge exchange activities in the vaccine ecosystem. So we're doing this in areas such as target product profiling. How do you know what vaccines to develop? What is the research and discovery aspect of it? What are the clinical and clinical studies that are needed to what are the biomanufacturing and regulatory affairs and deployment aspects in development? So we're doing this in 3 channels. So one, through internships that are being vaccine manufacturing institutes that aim at establishing a mentoring scheme that links interns with senior vaccinologists and health market systems and engagement of academics globally, where they're able to share and strengthen experiences and research experiences in vaccine research and development, and also linking them up to manufacturers to enhance career development. So the second way we're also being able to do this is through a fully funded 2-week master's course in vaccinology that is presented both in English and in French on site. So this is a physical kind of course that we will be hosting in Kenya for the year 2024. So look out for that. That's going to be in the first quarter of the year. Be on the watch. Constantly visit our website for more information for when we actually put up the call for applications. And applicants are selected. And applicants are going to be selected based on their direct involvement with vaccine research and their excellence in professional and academic achievements. So that the interpreter will up with the French translation for those who are on the French channel. The third way we're being able to do this is through quarterly webinars such as this one that target graduates and other undergraduate university students targeted in Africa, but open to the globe. And this is to provide information on possible career options for university students so that they're able to get informed career decision-making information. So this program is actually aligned with the African Union Partnership for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing, in short, PAVAM, who has an ambition to increase local vaccine production to meet 60% of African routine immunization needs by 2024 and strengthen the capacity of vaccine research, discovery, and manufacture in Africa. This webinar is part of this engagement. Today, we are glad to have Dr. Rebecca Grais, who will be discussing development studies for vaccines in emergencies or chronic conflict. Dr. Rebecca Grais is the Executive Director at Pasteur Network and has primary areas of research on prevention of infectious diseases, tropical diseases, and emerging infections in Sub-Saharan Africa. She has focused on population-based studies for the effectiveness of public health interventions and efficacy studies of novel vaccines and therapeutic agents in conflict and epidemic settings. Thank you so much, Datari, for joining us. Over to you. Would you want me to put up the slide deck?
Yep. So I just want to say hello to everyone. Et pour les francophones, il n'y a aucun problème en français. Hein? Vous n'avez pas besoin d'utiliser l'interprète pour cela. What I'll do is I wanted to say hello so you saw my face, and then I'll shut off my camera just to preserve the bandwidth and go through the presentation. So once Caroline has it up, that would be fantastic. Super. So Caroline, I'll just have to ask you. Yeah, it's perfect. I'll just have to ask you to help me switch slides. So if you can switch to the next slide.
Can you see it?
Not yet.
Oh.
Got it. Perfect. Yep. Oh, it was there a second ago.
Okay.
We'll get there. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about with this first slide is just a little bit about global health and the term global health. People use that term to describe a lot of things, but it's important just to remember that any definition is contentious and problematic. So whenever we say global health and people say that, what they mean really is a collaboration between people in high-income countries and people in low and middle-income countries, where the funding comes from outside the country where the activity or the research is conducted. So as a consequence of that, there are quite serious inherent power imbalances. And you all probably know the famous quote from Achebe, but also in terms of the history that we all have collectively, we're made by that history, but it doesn't have to define us. So understanding these power imbalances is essential in terms of vaccine development studies. If you hit the next slide, Carolyn. Right. So in order to push that a little bit further, it's also important to understand that the role of high-income countries and philanthropic organizations play a big role in setting the agenda in low-income countries. So what you see on this graph, it just comes from the WHO, and it's about the percentage of spending on debt servicing than on health. And so what you see from this is that a very large proportion of debt service is almost equivalent to that which is being spent on health, and as a consequence, research. So it puts everybody in a bind where money has to come from somewhere. And whenever money comes from somewhere else, it means that there is a necessity to negotiate. If you hit the next slide. So the consequence of this in terms of clinical trials, which you all certainly know, is that there's a very significant global mismatch. So only about 2 to 5% of RCTs globally are conducted in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the consequence of this, in addition to what I was just talking about earlier, is this low investment perpetuates reliance on a really small number of well-resourced funders, philanthropies, and industries. And what that means is that the wealthiest and best equipped institutions and organizations have a really significant advantage. They have competitiveness for funding, and they exercise control over the goals and the terms of partnerships. The last consequence of that is, as many of you are aware, research is expensive, and it often represents a disproportionately large amount compared to the needs of the population or those who are providing medical care. So all of this means that not everybody, even those the ones that should be, are always in control of the agenda. Next slide. So when we talk about conflict or crises, populations in crises have a significant risk of vaccine preventable diseases, which you all know. So if you just look at the statistics here, it's substantial. We have 20 million refugees, close to 40 million IDPs, about 1 billion people on the planet live in 40 fragile states. We have country-level natural disasters, the worst migration crisis since World War II, and 4 major crises in conflict zones. And all of this is exacerbated by the climate crisis. Next slide. But here's the thing, which is whoever defines what a crisis is doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about everybody. The definition of a crisis or the definition of a conflict is often something which comes externally and not by the people themselves. So sometimes it's more useful to think about it as vulnerable populations. And those populations have insufficient vaccination coverage, poor surveillance, limited access to care, very high birth rates in some cases. And exactly as I was saying, they're sometimes called a crisis, but sometimes not, and suffering from significant structural inequalities. Next slide. So the question that we have with respect to vaccines is we have a wide range of possibilities of vaccines in development and vaccines to be rolled out, but there are delays and obstacles everywhere. But when we look at this, accounting for this failure and why we have such a problem with this in terms of development is extremely difficult. And there's some significant reasons for that. Oh, Carolyn, would you mind putting back the slides?
Sorry,
Yeah.
switching off the video.
Okay, great. So what I'll do is talk about 5 of these reasons, which all of you can think about. and about why these delays and obstacles happen. This is not exclusive. It's just a list of what happens. And I'll use an example for each one. So if you click to the next slide, please. So this is about sparse, credible burden of disease and effectiveness data, which in fact, Caroline mentioned this at the beginning, which deals with the importance of setting out what's called a target product profile. So a good example for this is actually the rotavirus vaccine. So prior to recently, actually, there were 2 WHO pre-qualified rotavirus vaccines, Rotarix, which is manufactured by GSK, and Rotatech, which was manufactured by Merck. And what you can see here is that one is a 2-dose vaccine, one is a 3-dose vaccine. They have a large volume per dose, which is listed there, and the storage is in the cold chain. If you click to the next slide. So in terms of what those vaccines give, at least in a clinical trial, there's some key published data on vaccine efficacy, which was used, in fact, for the WHO pre-qualification of these vaccines. But what you see on this slide is a relatively wide range of efficacy. What's shown in this table, you have the country, the vaccine, and the efficacy from the randomized trial. If you switch to the next slide. And in a scenario like that, you might say to yourself, well, we need to see if there's some other solutions. So when you think about that, or when we all thought about that, one of the questions was, what could we do to improve upon this, especially for something like rotavirus, which is disproportionately affecting little kids in poor areas. So this isn't a formal TPP, but it gives you an idea of what's wanted, which is we wanted a vaccine with low unsubsidized costs, so a cost which is low without Gavi subsidies, heat stable, had a low volume, was adapted to the local epidemiology in the population, and we wanted to see about the immunogenicity of this to see if the performance of oral vaccines in vulnerable populations was somehow different. So a phase 3 trial was mounted in Niger using a vaccine against rotavirus, which met these criteria. Next slide. Oop. But a part of that is asking people and understanding what that disease burden is. So in order to do that in the country, we had a series of consultations with the government, stakeholders, parents, local, regional, and national health authorities, and also performed a study to look at what exactly the burden of diarrhea was and what the healthcare seeking behavior was of people. And so what was found in this study was that rotavirus accounted for about 30% of diarrhea cases. That's pretty standard. And in terms of healthcare seeking behavior, at least in this context, what was wanted most was a vaccine which was oral and available at a time when mothers were going to health centers. So if you click the next slide. So we did a landscape review of all of the vaccines in development for rotavirus and the manufacturers, and settled upon a vaccine manufactured by the Serum Institute of India. So this vaccine had good immunogenicity and safety data, had already been through trialing, but hadn't yet had a phase 3 trial in a place where it might be the most useful. And in addition to that, this is a vaccine which is stable for 18 months at 37 degrees Celsius and actually up to 40 degrees Celsius. So in a country like Niger, where average temperatures are that high, it was something that was quite promising, but we needed to make sure that efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity data was generated. Next slide. So after doing this trial, and it's problematic because a phase 3 trial just kind of gets a resume of one table of data, but it takes years to do, and it takes many people and a huge investment. And what you see here is that we were able to show that the vaccine efficacy in the per protocol population and the ITT population was significant and in line with previously licensed and WHO pre-qualified rotavirus vaccines. So the next slide. So one of the things which is interesting about these development studies is after we concluded the trial, the vaccine was licensed and WHO pre-qualified based on data from Niger and also the location of the manufacturer in India. It's now used in DRC, Burkina Faso. It was, or theoretically was going to be used in Ukraine, Angola, but overall it's been a pretty patchy rollout. There was, as a consequence also of all of this, very little to no uptake in the general media. The vaccine is supported by Gavi. And of the formulations being considered now, the 3-dose schedule, which is the one that I just showed you here, which is similar to the 2 previous ones, is still a barrier. Further to that, I mentioned that we used during the phase 3 trial the opportunity to look at immunogenicity in a vulnerable population for an oral vaccine. We looked at that and we looked at the microbiome, and there really wasn't anything interesting there. However, all that being said, what we were able to do with this study was to help to contribute to modify the WHO position paper on rotavirus vaccines in order to ensure that these vaccines are used and prioritized not only within an EPI age window, but beyond that, and also prioritized in scenarios where there's very little access to the population. It can be delivered orally by non-healthcare professionals. So this is an area where there was sparse data, there wasn't great credible amounts of data. And as a consequence of that, part of this trial in this population looked at trying to generate that and go all the way through a phase 3 trial through licensure and WHO pre-qualification, and in addition to that, into a recommendation, so that there would be the possibilities of countries and populations using this vaccine if they needed. Next slide. So a second barrier, which also goes along to this previous one about rotavirus, is the limited presentation, formulation, and storage of available vaccines. This is yet another reason why it's extremely difficult to have trials be conducted, to have development studies being done, especially for populations in conflict or those that are not in conflict but that are vulnerable. So the temperature range for vaccines, as all of you know, is designed to ensure quality and simplicity by following a single set of rules, no matter what. But the cold chain infrastructure is not always accessible in peripheral structures. We have demands on the cold chain, which are increasing with the introduction of new vaccines. And the cold chain itself can limit flexibility in terms of reaching vulnerable populations. So one possibility is using something called the controlled temperature cold chain, and this can be an advantage in regions where burden of vaccine preventable disease is highest. Next slide. So an example of this and how it's done is a study which was conducted in Moissala in Chad. So Moissala is a district of about 230,000 people. There's 20 health centers, 1 hospital. It's hot on average. That's just a mean, so it varies significantly. Where the administrative coverage among women of tetanus vaccine was not even 40% or close to 40%. The health centers, of 6 of the health centers out of 19 have no refrigerator, and the other 13 have sort of random cold chain, depending on electricity, and no generators. So what we wanted to do to sort of improve this situation was to look at whether it was possible to deliver tetanus vaccine in a controlled temperature cold chain compared to a cold chain in a non-inferiority cluster randomized design. Next slide. So what you see here in terms of the first step of doing something like this is to ensure that when vaccine vials are exposed at 10, 20, and 30 days to heat, that they remain viable. So the only thing which is important to see here is you'll see the 10 days, the ambient temperatures, the second from the bottom, at 20 days and at 30 days, we were able to maintain viability over time, even at high temperatures. Next slide. So that's great. Then the step after that is to look at, are they stable? Are these vaccines which are exposed, are they stable? And this is a study which was actually done in mice. And what you want to take away from this slide, it's a little bit of a complex slide, but it's not that important to understand, is that you want to make sure that the potency is above what's called an ED50. So that's just the effective dose, the 50% effective dose, is that the lower limit of that is something where it remains viable. And so in this case, the ED50 or the potency was exactly where we wanted to be. So we could then ensure that the vaccines were potent enough to be used in people. Next slide. When we looked at that in terms of stability, these are immunogenicity results. So these are the inverse cumulative distribution curves, which are often what's used to evaluate in geometric mean concentrations in CTC, controlled temperature cold chain, and the standard cold chain. And what you see on this graph is it's nothing that complicated, it's that the lines overlap. So what we know when we look at stability of these vaccines and we look at their ability to be used in people, as well as the immune response or the immunogenicity, is that it's all okay. So next slide. So, sorry, just before I start to this next one, what that shows you is that development studies go beyond studies which are phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. They're also, or phase 3, sorry. They can be phase 4 studies, which then allow you to ensure additional flexibility to help improve access, if access is an issue, of vaccines by looking at things like the stability. The third reason that we have all these barriers and delays, which I'll talk about here, is politics. And a good example of that is difficulties in using oral cholera vaccines. So there still remains a clear and real political hesitancy to declare cholera epidemics. Cholera epidemics can adversely affect economies. Aside from the declaration of any epidemic by a country which is fraught with political difficulty, cholera is particularly sensitive. The use of cholera vaccines, oral cholera vaccine, is debated between NGOs, donors, governments. Everybody has something to say. And there's lots of a prioris concerning timing, effectiveness, diversion of resources, and concerns about the use of a 2-dose vaccine in an epidemic. Further to that, the last part, which adds a little bit to this cacophony, is that the WHO guidance was vague at best. So what was interesting here to sort of improve the use of these vaccines in specific areas was to do a demonstration where we were able to show that not only was it possible, but that people came back to get the second dose and that there wasn't a diversion of resources as fit. So this is just a graph which shows vaccination coverage by dose and overall. This was done a while ago in Guinea with the support of the MOH and Médecins Sans Frontières Swiss. But unfortunately, since then, these problems abound. So the political considerations in terms of using a vaccine are often one of the most important obstacles. Next slide. The fourth one, which ties a little bit to the politics, is a lack of decision-making guidance. It's really complicated to know what to do, how to do it, what vaccines to need to be run through another clinical trial, which ones need an effectiveness trial, what's going on. And so the first component of that is recognizing or acknowledging that use of vaccines in crises or conflict is just thorny. And what usually happens is that what we know how to do takes supremacy over probably what we should do. And so ensuring that reasoning is scientifically sound helps to focus discussions on substance and reduces the scope for dismissing evidence. So focusing on what we have is really important, but where that evidence doesn't exist, we need to make sure that it's generated. So an example that fits this bill is that the current lack of guidance on the use of Ebola vaccines is a really good example of a little bit of the fallout. So the way that I'll explain this is just by talking about why that's the case, or one of the reasons why that happens is that there's poorly adapted methodological approaches in the trialing of these vaccines. So during the 2014 to 2016 West African Ebola outbreak, there was also an outbreak of mathematical modeling and forecasts about how this outbreak was going to be substantial, how everything was grim, how the world was going to succumb to a significant Ebola epidemic. And what you see on the right is just an example of a modeling study that was done in terms of predictions. So at the time of this outbreak, there was one vaccine which had gone quite far down the process and two others which were possible to trial, but only one of those vaccines was a one-dose vaccine. So the question was, for this unproven vaccine, how do we balance delivering a possibly effective intervention, so this one-dose vaccine, but also balanced with the need for safety, efficacy, and effectiveness, while all at the same time scaling up actually effective interventions. So it's important to recognize that anytime you're trialing something new, it needs to be put into this basket and make sure that the things that we do know work are done in a way that they're scaled up. So if you hit the next slide. So what happened in this outbreak was that there was something called the ring trial. So the ring trial looked at the efficacy of this one-dose vaccine against no vaccine among contacts of Ebola cases where the vaccine was delivered in what's called a ring. It's like a giant cluster. So this vaccine trial was a modification to a standard trial design. That sometimes can help, but we need to be able to understand it better. And it's essential to be able to explain and ensure transparency in terms of the data collection. And the last component of that is the way that a vaccine is trialed in a phase 3 study dictates often its future use. So what's interesting about this case study is that explaining this was extraordinarily complicated. On the right-hand side of that previous slide, I'll just talk about it, is a quote from, at the time, the head of the Ebola response in Guinea, who explained this study as a mass vaccination campaign to the population. That's not really what was going on. What was going on was this was a phase 3 trial with the vaccine being delivered in a way that it was possible to acquire efficacy data as well as safety data, but that meant that the understanding of this among potential participants as well as the population was very, very different. And so not only are you in a scenario where a methodological variation, which can be very helpful, is important to understand the consequences of that afterwards, but also ensuring that potential participants and the population themselves understand what is actually happening. Next slide. So those are just some examples with rotavirus, tetanus, cholera vaccines, the Ebola vaccines, which are all examples of vaccines which went through either pivotal trialing in a conflict situation or a vulnerable population, or vaccines which have as a specific target to be used within epidemics, either for their control or for their prevention. But so the most important thing here is thinking about how do we minimize a little bit of this mess. And so there's 4 key things here, which I think are important to consider. The first one is that we need to fund and support sound documentation of burden of disease. As all of you are certainly aware, there can often be a paucity of information which is sufficient with which to trial a vaccine or to support its use. The second is that once a vaccine is licensed or WHO pre-qualified, that's often too late. So we want to encourage discussion based on that robust data which is available and adapt the vaccine product profiles before licensure or pre-qualification. In addition to that, the more data that's available, we're able to ensure that we're designing effective high coverage interventions, which then as a consequence minimize political difficulties. I'm not saying they disappear, on the contrary, but we want to make sure that we do everything that we can to not exacerbate them. And then the fourth part is just to recognize that the populations that need these interventions are rarely consulted. Neither are those people who are delivering them. So the best way to go about that is to ensure that at first there's a discussion with people who would potentially benefit. And the second one is with people who would potentially deliver them. So the question for you guys all is, so what should I do? So I'll go through some of these things quite quickly, and then we can talk about it. If you switch to the next slide. So in terms of trialing or doing development studies of vaccines in crisis or conflict settings, you want to expect the unexpected. That's kind of normal. So, but what's often forgotten about is that risk management in these settings includes scientific risk management. So in terms of how to do that, there's many ways to do it, but these are 3 key questions which are really important to keep in mind. The first one is, what have I achieved if failure is likely to be the outcome of my study? What have I done? What have I given back? What do I get out of it? What does this study or activity contribute to the participants, to knowledge, to the staff if it's stopped? What happens if I start a trial and I can't go forward? How do I deal with this? What do people get out of it? What does the study team get out of it? What does the population get out of it? How do we move that forward? And what can be included in the design of the study to ensure that something is obtained if disaster strikes? All those things are constant and common scenarios whenever trying to do a development study in a crisis or conflict. Next slide. Or not. You got it, Carolyn? Yep. Okay, so this one, the francophones will recognize this. This is just a famous quotation in French. The second part is in terms of savoir, or to know. So successful global health projects, or the ones that would be conducted here, depend on the institutional organizational ability and your ability as somebody who may potentially lead one of these studies to manage all aspects of it. And this part is often not necessarily given as much credit as it deserves. So financial management and good practices, HR policies and professional development, contracting and negotiations, inclusion to ensure research is relevant to the communities in which it's conducted, and benefits sharing. There's lots of ways to do this, but as I mentioned at the beginning, any time where something is costly, and specifically with respect to conflict and crises, this is almost always the case, there needs to be an underlying principle, which is which is instituted from the beginning to try and address some of these power imbalances. There's many of these. One of them is something called the Research Fairness Initiative, which helps guide individuals towards better negotiation and ensuring that all of these issues are taken care of. The next one, savoir-être, is how am I, is recognizing that in any of these projects, semantics are not universal. So global health is a multicultural and multilingual endeavor. The projects often fail for lack of common understanding of roles and responsibilities and priorities. I mean, COVID examples, we can talk about that. COVID vaccines is a really contentious example. What you have on the right is something which is key, which is the fact that being wrong is important, which is sharing lessons about failure is an essential component to doing this. And almost everyone is wrong at some point in their lives. I like these two particular examples because I just find them very funny. But in terms of how to move forward, recognizing that and ensuring that in the conduct of the trial, there are mechanisms to be wrong is very important. Next slide. The next one is faire savoir, or make sure that other people know. So in the example that I was discussing about the Ebola vaccine in Guinea, where it was portrayed as a mass campaign, that's an example sort of what we don't really want to have happen. So you want to ensure that you're clearly communicating the objectives of the activity or the project or the study, whatever you want to call it, to the population and being extremely clear about that. What are the expected outcomes? Who benefits from doing something like this and who doesn't? What the future possibilities are or are not. It's better to lay that on the table than to have to deal with it later. And then finally, the results, irrespective of what they are made public to participants, authorities, and the scientific community. Publishing a paper isn't enough. It's got to be more than that. Next slide. And when you're in doubt, I don't know if you all know who Spike Lee is, but you should listen to Spike Lee. You just need to, you'll see, I won't say the word, bust your behind and recognize that luck plays a role, and some by nature of their birth are more lucky than others. If you want to do this, that's fantastic. Some of you will be lucky, some of you will be less lucky, but you can all move forward. And then my last slide, I just wanted to let you all know about where I work now. So in 2020 and 2021, what was formerly called the Réseau des Instituts Pasteur was renamed as something called the Pasteur Network. So it's 32 institutions in 25 countries spread over 5 continents. And these institutes employ thousands of researchers, engineers, and technicians, and also have on the left all of these different things. But the aim of this now is to make this network into a real one, and not into a real one, to enhance it, to move it forward, and to modernize it, to ensure that there is participation across all institutions. So that's part of my job. And I'm happy, of course, to discuss with any of you what we just talked about or what I'm doing now. Thanks, Caroline. You can stop the presentation. I think it'll be easier.
Thank you so very much for a very informative presentation. And I always assume that I know what I'm doing in vaccinology until we have such amazing speakers and I get a different perspective to the same topic that we always keep discussing every single day we come to work. So we have a couple of questions that are coming in, and there are quite a number of them. So what I will do is just quickly just go through them. And you can be able to just maybe answer a few of them as they're coming in. We have a question from Amadou, who has asked, what are the challenges of a vaccine trial conducted in the midst of an epidemic?
Well, so I think that that was a little bit what I was talking about. So it depends on what kind of epidemic, and it depends on what kind of vaccine and what kind of trial. But in general, the challenges are ones of ensuring that whether something is done in an epidemic or not, that it's done to the same standard and same rigor as if it weren't in an outbreak. And so what that means is that for vaccines which have for their use something which is reactive or using it in an epidemic to control or to prevent further spread, if you will, is that the design and the way that it happens, it's robust enough to ensure that a sufficient amount of data is collected. For me, at least in my experience, the biggest challenges of trialing vaccines in an epidemic are political, and it's getting it off the ground. I don't have a lot of tips about that because I really think it depends on the context, it depends on the vaccine, and on what you're doing.
Awesome, thank you. So we also have another question that from Abadu, who has asked that with very little biomanufacturing in Africa, what mechanisms can be used to improve the implementation of phase 1 and phase 2 in Africa?
So I'm a big fan of South-South collaborations for phase 1 and phase 2. There are many very, very good phase 1 and phase 2 sites, both in Latin America and in Asia, which could be used and partnered with sites in Sub-Saharan Africa to move forward. KEMRI is a great resource on the continent. In South Africa, there are others, but more partnering across institutions, I think, would be of big use. That being said, all of this necessitates money, which is what I was explaining earlier. So at least for the moment, it's much more likely that that money would come from a high-income country, in which case institutions need to be prepared and well-equipped to ensure that the negotiations about how that partnership is done in the best way. In terms of biomanufacturing, I think it will take a while, but there are definitely great steps forward, and ensuring that in each location where biomanufacturing is occurring, there is an explicit and dedicated investment in the research and development ecosystem is the most important as well. So what do I mean by that? I mean that we want ideally to move to a world where manufacturers are able to conduct everything from A to Z in the research and development chain, if you will. And so reinforcing that ecosystem means training, education, support to infrastructure, which also has a positive feedback on the economy of the area. And then the last one I see, how to reverse the trend towards more vaccine clinical trials in Africa. But I think you have to have people that are rich say no. People that have the power have to say no to conducting it somewhere else. And then on the continent, I think it's gradually improving and building and reinforcing the financial infrastructure so that those trials can be paid for there. Further to that, I think biomanufacturing actually makes a difference there because it's more important, because with respect to licensure, vaccines need to be trialed at one point, at least some of the components of the development process in the country of manufacture. So the more manufacturing there is, it actually helps with that. I am in no way saying that any of this is easy or that it's going to happen tomorrow, but it's a process and it's important to move that way.
Let me throw a twist to that question. In as much as we want to reverse, this reversing of the trend most likely is because we end up having development in other countries and then they come and run the trials here in Africa. Since we want to we're looking at a situation where we're building our own vaccines for our own conditions and diseases. How would we be able to find that balance where we're developing it and still being able to have clinical trials that are targeted for what we want and not being done on behalf of other institutions and other continents where they just use Africa just as a test phase rather than at the development phase? How do you find that balance?
So I think there's two things. So that's a little bit, Caroline, about reinforcing the R&D ecosystem as a whole. So there's two parts. There's the research part and there's the development part. So on the research side, that means ensuring that basic research, preclinical research, fundamental research is conducted on the continent so that it can contribute to future development studies. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, sometimes 2B, 2A, all that stuff. That's one. The second thing is reinforcing and supporting the regulatory infrastructure on the continent. So like the African Medicines Agency is extremely important. There needs to be a regulatory authority able to do this, which is mature enough, if you will, to ensure that the vaccines that are licensed on the continent can then go through the PQ process if needed or be marketed. And then the third one, in terms of development studies, is those absolutely need to be conducted on the continent. I don't think that it's reasonable to think that all of this is going to happen simultaneously. It's a step-by-step process. And then the other part, I think, which is important just to recognize, is that the competition is fierce. It's absolutely fierce. And that development studies for vaccines in general are rare. So the more that those can be done on the continent, the better. But in addition to those development studies being done on the continent, everything else needs to be done on the continent. So the burden of disease data, looking at and developing the TPPs, making sure that the fundamental research is conducted on the continent, and then also all that's happening, making sure that regulatory authorities, as well as ministries of health, and then the public system, as well as the private, are engaged. It's a lot, but it's possible.
Yeah, that's quite a bit. If you have anybody in the audience who would like to unmute and ask a question, kindly just raise your hand. And we're still taking more questions, which are quite interesting as they're coming in the Q&A box. We have a question from Primus, who has asked, what has been the role of social science research within your ongoing work? Quite interesting.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of social science research in what I can personally control, which is absolutely tiny. As I mentioned, I think it's really important in order to have successful trials be conducted, that the participants, as well as beneficiaries or people that are going to use this vaccine, are consulted and participate, as well as ensuring that those that are going to deliver it are also able to participate. And then the last component of that is looking at how we can improve the conduct of trials to ensure that the community wants the trial. If the community doesn't want the trial, then it probably shouldn't be done there, in my opinion, no matter what a funder or ethical committee or your doctoral supervisor tells you. That's probably a bad idea. So from my personal perspective, I think it's essential.
Thank you. So I had a couple of thoughts as you're doing your presentation, especially with vaccine development in chronic conflict or epidemics. It means that the turnaround time is usually shorter than what would normally be the normal timeline. With the introduction, so something like COVID vaccine that was introduced, what is done after the introduction? Are there still studies that are done to look at the long-term side effects or adverse effects, and how is that handled?
So it depends, Caroline, on the vaccine and on the epidemic and on the context. So COVID is different. COVID was a pandemic and affected really rich countries. So there's lots of ongoing studies about the vaccines that were used there, for sure. And those are studies, phase 4 studies, or effectiveness studies often, which are done in the long term, either to look at the vaccine performance or to look at specific impacts of the use of the vaccine or long-term sequelae. In other epidemics or other crisis settings, that's not always a given. Long-term follow-up studies can be extremely difficult to fund and extremely difficult to do. Because what often happens in an epidemic is everybody's focused on the epidemic or the pandemic for a while it happens, and then they forget about it right afterwards. And so people are less likely to do that. I think that that's an important area. I mean, especially for all of you on the phone to listen to, that's a very neglected area to look at, which is to look at what happens afterwards. But it's tough to do in practice.
Since majority of my audience in this particular webinar is either people still in university doing something medical related or health science related, or early career scientists who, or even just senior scientists who just want to pivot into vaccinology, what would a career path look like for them to end up doing what you're doing?
I think you're not going to like my answer, Caroline. I don't think there is a career path. There's not one good career path, and there's not a bad career path. I think in my case, I have a massive advantage, which I was educated in a high-income country. I had exposure to all sorts of things, which meant that I'm able to navigate in certain areas, which allowed me to do what I'm doing. For other people, if this is something that you do want to do, I think it's important to think about why you're doing it. If you're doing it for money or for a position, it's probably the wrong career. You have to do it because you really both believe in it and are conscious of the fact that studies are a collective endeavor, so they're not individual endeavors, and that you would be a part of a much larger whole. And then the last one is you just have to work really hard, and you have to put yourself in. If you have any opportunities, you need to take it. But there is absolutely not one way to do this.
Great. The beauty of where we end up is quite interesting, and I like that the fact that you were very outward about it, that there's not a particular career path. I look at my background and started off in microbiology, picked up epidemiology along the way, and found myself in vaccinology. The one common thing for me was that I was interested in just being able to be in health sciences and being able to give back through research. So I think that just channeled me into an environment and into a space like KEMRI-Wellcome Trust and Pasteur Network, that you meet like-minded people working within this particular space, and you pick up something and you run with it. So for the audiences who are here, who are still trying to figure out what to do, I think it's work with what you have, the different ways of approaching this, and just being able to find that space where you're able to access more information such as these webinars and the apprenticeships that we're offering. I'll quickly just jump into a question that Inez has asked, and he's asked, what is your strategy for starting, developing, validating, and then producing and commercializing African vaccines? Do you have one?
Ula. What is my strategy for starting?
The whole pipeline of vaccinology development. Is there any strategy, or did you just jump in as a network and figure it as you go along?
Yes, that is a really, really tough question. So, with respect to producing and commercializing vaccines on the continent, there are many different initiatives. In terms of the ones that I'm most familiar with, there's the Institute Pasteur of Dakar in Senegal and the Institute Pasteur de Tunisie, so in Tunisia. Both of them are what's called a messenger RNA hub, which was a project or an initiative supported after the COVID pandemic to produce messenger RNA-based vaccines on the continent. In terms of which antigens or which vaccines will be produced, that's still being discussed, but they have to be ones which both have a significant health burden on the continent, and also ideally ones where there is some type of market failure. But all of those things are done with a whole bunch of people around the table. Like everybody, right? Like the president has to agree with things like that. The other people that hold pieces of technology have to agree. The regulators. It's a collective decision, actually. And across the continent, those same conversations take place, but you may have different people around the table. Does that help? Oh, wait, I just see these other questions. Caroline, do you mind if I just go through these?
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of this other question, do you think creating awareness could increase vaccine? Yeah, I do. Definitely. But I think it's a fine line to do that. But I think that creating awareness in different places could help support that. It's more important to me that populations understand and are able to choose for themselves and understand than anything else. And so any type of awareness helps to ensure that, because it can help to ensure that there is a choice made afterwards. Bernadette. Oh, Bernadette, I totally agree with you. So when I started this job, if you look at the map, which you'll see here, there's, let's call them French associated countries, Bernadette. Yes, I would very, very much like to expand the network to both East and Southern Africa. And Kenya certainly would be an excellent choice. Then there was Eunice's question, then Primus, social sciences. Yep, okay, we're good. Sorry, I was just checking, Caroline.
No problem. So something that I kept thinking about is, how does social media influence the decisions that you make, especially in situations like now with the Hamas and all these conflict areas that are chronically in a state of conflict? How does social media influence the decisions that you make in terms of which vaccines to develop and which vaccines to put on the back burner?
Mm-hmm. So I don't think social media plays a big role in deciding which vaccines to develop, but it certainly plays a role in terms of which vaccines to trial in a conflict or a crisis. So the way that that's handled, and this is something where I don't remember who asked this before, but about social science research, which is extremely important, is that one of the things to do is to ensure that there is what's called good participative practices for communities, which involves looking at social media, monitoring social media, to understand rumors, to understand what is factual, and the interpretation of what could happen if a vaccine was trialed. That is just good practice and should be done with any vaccine trial, actually, whether it's in a conflict or a crisis at all, but at any point in time. And then that can have a role in terms of whether you're able to continue with your trial or whether you should stop. But those decisions should be made independently from the selection of the vaccine. Does that make sense, Caroline?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Yes, it does. Awesome. I'm trying to see whether we have any more questions that are coming in. This is your last chance to interact with our very good doctor. Can't see anything that has come in. So, yes.
It's not. Wait, I wanted to say something.
Any last words, Rebecca?
Yes, I was going to say it's not your last chance. You can, my email is at the first slide, or I can put it in the chat, actually. Can I?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Yeah, and what we'll be able to also do as part of our closing is just be able to share an email address that will have all this content plus the recording of this particular webinar for your colleagues who may not have been able to join us. We are very much aware that we're heading towards the holidays and people are relaxing or have taken time off from their offices. So we will have this recording shared among our networks. And we will be including your contact address, Dr. Rebecca, just so that anyone wanting to reach out for more information will be able to continue this conversation after this. This is supposed to have been a teaser of some sort to just start off a conversation for it to continue even after this webinar. So thank you very much for having given us an amazing session today. And thank you for all those who are able to attend this webinar. This was very informative and very interactive. And thank you for that. We would like to hear about your experiences and what else you'd like to discuss in upcoming forums. Remember, I had mentioned that this is a part of a series that we're doing for 2023 and 2024. So before we close, I will be sending out, and you will see an email coming in from vaccinology at KEMRI-Wellcome It will have a form that is a very easy form to fill in, 2 minutes, for you to just be able to give us feedback on what areas you liked, what areas you'd like us to improve on, and what particular topics you would be interested in hearing, so that we're able to develop webinars that actually do address the needs within our community. From me and my team, who has worked very hard behind the scenes, our translators who have done an amazing job, our speaker today who has really given us a lot to think about. From me to you and from the Pasteur Network, it is me saying thank you very much for spending time with us. It's been almost an hour and a half plus, and you're still here with us. I hope to see you early next year. Have a good day, and looking forward to more engagement with you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dr. Grais.